Great.
Hello, welcome to our AMF Members Discussion Forum. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these forums. The AMF Discussion Forum is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this forum is to bring our community members an opportunity to engage with some amazing people and to discuss various ways to normalize and educate the community at large about the issues of grief. Our guest today is Harold Ivan Smith. Harold is a thanatologist and independent scholar. For 18 years, he served on the teaching faculty of St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. He also was a celebrant for Speaks Memorial Chapels, Independence, Missouri, and now for Forest Lawn Mortuary in Palm Springs, California. He has earned graduate degrees from Scarritt College, from Vanderbilt University, and his D.Min from Asbury Theological Seminary. Harold is the author of numerous books and publications, including his most recent, Almost Everything Worth Knowing About Harry S. Truman. Known for his storytelling, Harold is a highly sought-after presenter and leader among the end-of-life bereavement fields. Harold, my friend, it is a pleasure to have you as a guest on our AMF discussion forum. Welcome you.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's good to see great faces I haven't seen in a while, and I hope this time is very, very enjoyable for you, because I think it's going to be for me.
Wonderful. Harold, so recently we did a recording with you on our Let's Talk Death, and you had shared an experience you had when a school friend's parent died. Before we dive into your work, might you share that experience with your audience, with our audience?
Oh boy, give me a little bit more. I'm sorry. I'm having more than a senior moment, apparently.
Yeah, no.
About your school friend, your schoolmate, his
father worked where your father worked.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm totally blank.
Okay, well, let's go into your personal grief experience.
Okay. Oh yes. I'm sorry, it took just a little, Johnny Rodden.
We love to throw our guests off.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I'm going to have to find those memory pills. And I grew up in a highly unusual Southern family. And my dad worked for the Louisville Gas and Electric Company. This is decades before there was the idea of OSHA and all the safety regulations and safety rules. And in first grade, Jimmy and I had Mrs. Sinkhorn, that was her name, who was 1 foot toward retirement, and she just couldn't tolerate 6-year-olds and their energy and pretty much let us do whatever we wanted. So while other children were playing cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers, Johnny and I were playing Louisville Gas and Electric. And we were going around cutting off people's electricity and turning on people's electricity, such things. And Miss Sinkhorn just said, whatever, as long as you don't make too much noise. And then there came that day, we had that time where you had nap time, you had to put your head down. And Jimmy was just like 3 up from me in the next row. So we would look at each other during what was supposed to be nap time. And one day somebody walked into the room and they spoke to Mrs. Sinkhorn. And she looked up and said, Johnny, would you get your things and would you go with this man? He got his things, left the room. And then Mrs. Sinkhorn told us that his dad had just been killed on the job, actually electrocuted. Now, that was problematic for me in a way different than those other 28 students, because Mr. Rodenkamp, his father, had taken my dad's place that week while my dad was on vacation. And once the details came out, in my 6-year-old mind, I was beginning to say, if it had not been Mr. Rodenkamp, it would have been my dad that would have died that day. My family believed in going to funeral homes. Almost 50 of my father's men, this is hard to believe, died, and many by electrocution in those days. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of horseplay, and sometimes it ended up deadly. So we went to the funeral home, and of course, my dad marched us all to the front by the casket, and there was Mrs. Rodenkamp, the widow, and my dad said, "Tell Mrs. Rodenkamp how sorry you are." And I couldn't form those words, because to be honest, I wasn't really sorry. And my dad said, "I said, tell Mrs. Rodenkamp how sorry you are." And I kind of dug my face into my dad's leg. And my dad did not like to repeat things to children. And then Mrs. Rodenkamp intervened and said, "That's all right, Mr. Smith. I'm sure Harold Ivan is very sorry." And I watched my friend that night, because I just thought, boy, if it had not been his dad, my dad had not been on vacation, that would have been me in that chair at the funeral home. I can't remember how many days later, he came back to school, and Mrs. Sinkhorn religiously ruled that you could not just look out the window. That stirred her wrath, except he was allowed to look out the window. And there were times I noticed him just staring out the window, and I was so wondering, what was he thinking about? And then one day he just didn't come back to school. And he never did come back to school, and I lost track of him. But that was a unique experience of being thrown into grief. And then there's one caveat. I grew up in a very fundamentalist holiness church, which believed more than likely you were not going to make it to heaven. Just the reality was more than likely you weren't going to make it. So they preached on hell all the time. And I was just a scared little child, especially when we had electrical storms and my dad was called at midnight or 1 a.m. to get a crew together and go out and get the lights back on. And there was always that fear I had, something's going to happen to my dad. Now, my dad was never electrocuted. He did fall significantly off telephone poles a couple times, but he was not electrocuted. But that was always in my mind. And so that was my kind of introduction. And I was a curious little kid, though. And rather than being afraid of it, I loved to go to the funeral home. Oh, we're going to the funeral home. Great. That's great. And while my parents were talking, I was known to kind of wander around, checking things out. And there were times the directors had to lead me back to my mother and father, and there was a scolding involved. But kind of a strange juxtaposition between those two. And at ADEC, at the 2019 conference, when I talked about this, I really believe in the clinician's heart and mind, you have to audit those antecedent losses that Bill Warden talks about. You have to take a look at those. And some of those are so critical, and there are details that are not quite there that become very important. If I can tell one more story, my cousin suicided. And Wilma was much older than I was, because I was the baby of the family. And I never could figure that out. Why? She had a good life. Why would she take her life? And at my mother's visitation, I mean, the meal, when you come back to the church and eat fried chicken and potato salad, there was my mother's sisters sitting around the table. And I don't know how it came up, but I said, there's something I've never understood. Why Wilma shot herself. And suddenly the place went silent, and people started grabbing up plates and heading, gotta go, gotta get home. And I thought, what in the world did I say? And I don't know how many weeks it took, but eventually one aunt and I talked, and I said, what was that about? And she said, don't you know? I said, I have no idea why she shot herself. And then she told me that my uncle had been sleeping with her for years and that she was mentally unstable, and she took her life. Now, coming from that ultra-conservative family, no one had ever mentioned that, but I did find out other people in the family knew about it. I was the one person who did not know. So I finally said, I think I've had all the data I can handle. So the next night, my great aunt called, and she said, your Uncle Clay and I have been talking, and there's something else you need to know. And I thought, oh, Lord, what is this going to be? And she said, well, you need to know your uncle told her, if you're going to kill yourself, make sure you do it good. And here's where you put the gun and all of this. And I just finally said, I can't talk anymore. That my uncle would show her how to use the gun in such a way that she would take her life. Very strange, but it introduced me to the power of family secrets. And sometimes I think in very, very religious families, there are even more secrets that really affect the grieving process. So those today are kind of like bookends for me that shape how I came to at least fear death, try to accommodate death in my life, and ultimately they probably factored in why I do what I do for a profession.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. One of the things that we love actually about this discussion forum is just learning some of those stories behind all of us. And the interesting thing, as you're telling your story, I think about my own, and I know that there are others who are in our audience. It just takes you back to your own experience that, like, why did I even start doing this to begin with? And what shaped me in that way?
Somebody ought to do a book, Why Do You Do What You Do? I like to joke when I was flying, this is the longest period in 40 years that I haven't flown, but you get those nervous people in the middle seat, Bubba, what kind of line of work are you in? And I always like to say death. And they go, well, I'm deaf myself. Do you sell hearing aids? No, death, dying, bereavement. And they're one of two responses. One is, I could never do what you do. And then you could expect somebody to say, now, how can you do that kind of work? And I always had this game I love to play. I'd look around. Well, I'll tell you, but you can't tell anybody. Okay, I won't tell anybody. We make so much money doing this that you just would not believe how much money we make. And they go, well, I knew there was some reason you could do that kind of work. And I never wanted to break the news to them. No, that was a joke. We really don't make, or most of us don't make that kind of money. And then I had the nervous ones who just started right into the back of the seat, looking through, maybe there's a magazine or something they needed to order. And they didn't talk to me the rest of the trip. And that was good for me, because that way I got to read. But that whole thing of why do you do what you do and how do you do it? And I will admit, there have been some times that I've had to think about, why is it that I do what I do? Because sometimes you have those situations that are just so overwhelming that you go, boy, I just need a chance to think about this one. And I also believe that sometimes we need to talk it out with other colleagues who have some understanding of what it is we do.
Interesting. And why do you do what you do?
Well, I think it's a sense of calling. Going back to that childhood experience, I really believe you either avoid it and run from it. And I was very influenced by Irving Yalom at Stanford, who was head of psychiatry for decades. And he always argued that many of his medical students and his residents, the reason they had gone to med school was they had great death anxieties. They had great fear of death. And they believed if they went to med school, they could learn ways to fight off death. And that whole sense, at St. Luke's, and I miss this, not having a grief group, doing grief groups here in Palm Springs. there was that sense of those magic moments when somebody brought up something and suddenly everybody started talking. There were the moments when some people came back and stuck their heads in the door and said, we just wanted to tell you we're doing well, and would sometimes encourage the grievers, keep coming back. This group really helps. And it was looking back at some of those individuals and seeing, in a couple of cases, close to miracles. I don't use that word lavishly, but I do think in 18 years at St. Luke's, there were a couple bona fide miracles that stunned me, absolutely stunned me.
Amazing.
So I think that's why, yeah.
Amazing. So Harold, you've written many, many books, but I want to dive into your most recent, Almost Everything Worth Knowing about Harry S. Truman. And one of the things I want to make a quick tie into that, you had said that your father, that your community would go together and go to funerals, and that's what you did. And if I recall, Harry Truman always showed up at funerals.
That's right. He always did. Matter of fact, I've had an amazing experience since I talked to you. I decided that I was going to do in the next book on Harry Truman, which is going to be his spiritual biography, that I'd really look at his view of death. And I had a list of deaths of people and the funerals he had gone to, but that kept expanding. And I don't know what I'm going to do, because that chapter, The Rough, is now over 100 pages. He went to so many funerals. That's what you did. And I have a picture of him as an elderly man. When the editor of the newspaper in Independence died, he was named an active pallbearer, not honorary, active. And in the First Presbyterian Church in Independence, to bring that casket in, you had to go up several steps. It's a good little hike carrying that casket. And here was Harry Truman carrying his share of that casket of his friend into the First Presbyterian Church. So many of these things were people, he always tried to go to services of men he served with in World War I, because many of them were from the Kansas City, Independence area, so he kept friendships with them. In one case, he was the only person. No one came to the visitation. Nobody was at the funeral. And it was cold, there was snow, it was very cold. And the funeral director said, and the minister, Reverend Nelson, talked and said, let's get out of here. Nobody was visitation, nobody's going to come to this. Let's get him in the ground. And Dr. Nelson said, I think we'd better wait till 2 o'clock. And I tell you, that's what time it was in the paper. If no one's here at 2, I'm going to do just a prayer and we'll let the men bury him and we'll get out of here. Okay, that's what they're going to do. He said about 1 or 2 minutes before 2, he looked up and goes, oh no, oh no. And he saw a green Chrysler coming in down the lane in the cemetery. And Dr. Melton starts moving because there was an elderly gentleman in the front seat. And he's trying to get out of the car. And Dr. Melton is throwing his frame against the door to keep him in. And he said, roll down the window. And he said, I've got to get under that tent. No, sir, you stay in the car. I'll do the service from here. And when Dr. Melton finished the service, he looked down into the car and he said, Mr. President, what are you doing here? It's cold. You shouldn't be out in weather like this. This was in his retirement. And he pointed that bony finger toward the grave and he said, I was with that man in France. And I never forget my men. And Dr. Melton said, I would have had to resign the pastorate of the church and leave Independence. If Harry Truman got in that cemetery and that casket was already in the ground and we were off getting warm, so we're drinking coffee. He dug graves when he was a farmer. And it's quite a story that he tells because, you know, that whole tradition was so important. I did my doctoral dissertation on friend grief. And in rural areas in those days, before cemeteries were unionized and businesses, men of the community, as did my grandfather and my father, came forward and dug the grave as something you could do. And what I discovered is that they would talk and brag and tell wild stories. And sometimes, because they were afraid of getting dehydrated, they had beverages that kind of helped them in the digging. And Harry Truman often said, "You've never heard so many lies as you can hear digging a grave." And of course, then he had to, clean up and go to the funeral, and then they finished up afterwards. But that experience was always very much on his mind. The one that hurt him the most, well, two really did, but Harry Truman was nearly assassinated in 1950 by two Puerto Rican nationalists. And he was not living in the White House because the White House was closed for restoration, total rebuilding. And he was across the street at Blair House. And, this is hard to believe. There was just very little security. You could walk right past the front door of Blair House. Yes, there were policemen there, but it happened. And sure enough, while Harry was taking a nap, these two gunmen began shooting and killed one of the police officers, severely wounded another. And in the process, before air conditioning, and Harry Truman didn't like air conditioning anyway, he stuck his head out the window. So the gunman was just below him, could have lifted the gun and shot Harry Truman in the head right there. And so then after the shooting was over, Harry Truman went to the Arlington National Cemetery for a memorial service. And he just said that's part of it. But 2 days later, Harry Truman was back in Arlington, this time following the casket of John Kofeld, who had given his life for Harry Truman. And Harry Truman said, "You cannot imagine the weight on your shoulders when you know a young man, has died for you to protect your life." Harry Truman had been used to walking in the mornings, doing all that kind of stuff, very little Secret Service protection. And he said, "I can't have the responsibility of another man getting shot." And so he had to defer after that to Secret Service regulations. But it was a weight that carried on his mind for years. And some of those deaths that he had were very, very difficult. And he said, as you get older, and of course he had buried all of his family, except his sister. He had buried so many friends that he had served in World War II, and that began to bother him. He said in his 70s, you spend a lot of time remembering people who are gone. And he was very open about it. Many people would have not said anything like that. But he was always very open about these realities of life. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that chapter. I don't think anybody would be interested in a book about death and Harry Truman. So I'm going to have to take the hacksaw and cut that chapter, like wood pilings, to get it down to an acceptable length. But he was really our last president that really followed those kinds of things. He did eulogies, and death was a part of his life. It bothered him in 1950 when he had to send so many young men into Korea. And, we just passed the atomic energy, the 75th anniversary. And I'll never forget, I was in the Truman Library to meet Rosalind Carter. And there was a line, and so we were waiting, and, you begin chatting or eavesdropping on other people. And the man in front of me, an older man, began crying. And his wife said, "What is wrong with you?" And along that corridor in the library, they have all these probably 3x2 pictures of Truman in various things, settings. And he raised his finger and pointed at that picture and said, "If it wasn't for that man, I wouldn't be in this world." And the wife glanced at the picture. "What are you talking about? That's Harry Truman. How is he responsible?" And he said, "During World War II, I was in the Pacific, and I would have been one of the first ones going in if we had had to invade Japan. I might not have survived. I might not have come home, married you. I'd never had the children. That's why I owe my life to that man." I've never forgotten the power of that story.
Interesting.
He was so
Very interesting.
emotional. Yeah.
Harold, we have a question. Buffy,
Oh,
you
okay.
want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Me?
No,
No.
Buffy. No.
Okay.
Buffy.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Harold, Ivan, and
Hi.
Andy, and Fran. It's good to see you guys.
Hi.
So we work with a funeral home in a division that we help people that are grieving.
Good
And
for
as
you.
you were kind of talking about, people saying to you, how do you do what you do? Why do you do what you do? It's very difficult, obviously, for many people during this pandemic, but I was wondering if you had any advice for those of us that are working with grieving people. Can we connect with them, keep those connections strong, doing it virtually for the most part, and
Yeah.
also maybe if you had any thoughts about how do we keep doing what we're doing in a time like this?
Oh, okay. Very good question. Let me say, sometimes when I'm asked that question, I kind of evaluate how much does the questioner want to know about why I do what I do. And often I've said, historically, we all pitched in. There were no professional funeral directors. We all had parts to do. There may have been a mortician who did the embalming, provided the chairs, but basically, even to this day in some religions, the dressing is done by members of the faith, all of that. And I think it is difficult. One of the things that has bothered me, I left St. Luke's after 18 years, and basically they've discontinued the program now. And so I suddenly went, man, I invested 18 years in that. I still have hopes they're going to have second thoughts, but it's doing what we can do. We can't do what we once did, and we can't do what we'd like to do, but it's about reaching out. I think the hardest thing that's going to come back to haunt us about this period is the number of people who've been excluded from, quote, paying their respects. I know among elders, at least in my family, you didn't really have to know the person. You might know their sister, but you still went to the visitation. That was what decent church-going folks did. And it wasn't just 5 minutes signing the book. You stayed and talked to people. And so that rich heritage is really gone. And the number of funerals that have been limited to 10 people, or here in the Valley to 10 minutes. I will give you a personal story that really devastated me. Under the rules of the cemetery where the burial was going to take place, this was Palm Sunday. Good Friday. And it was raining in the desert. That doesn't happen in Palm Springs, but it was raining. And I go, well, not to worry. They'll have that green tent and, chairs, not to worry. I get to the cemetery, there's no tent and there are no chairs. And actually only one person was allowed to come to that gravesite. And she had a scarf as a mask and had sunglasses. So, this was hard, and we were maybe 8 feet apart. But I had told her that we were going to have a full service. And we did. I don't know how long it went, long enough to irritate some of the staff, apparently. But this was this woman's experience. And finally, I walked up to her and I said, I know that I am not supposed to hug you. But you're burying your mother today, and the only thing I know to do is I'll put my head that way, but I'm going to hug you. And I did. I came home wet, soaked, because there was no umbrella for me. Water coming off the casket, just awful situation. And yet I kept saying, I wish I could have done this. I wish I could have done this. But finally having to say, I've done what I could do. That Good Friday was the best I could do. And I think we need, and I said it the other day about, I am concerned that we've praised, rightly so, our nurses, our doctors, the EMRs who rush to the scene to help people. We've done all of that, but we have not recognized our funeral directors and funeral staff, such as yourself. who are heroes as well. My aunt fell, she's 95, and so I was talking to her about, that's not a good idea to fall at 95 outside. And she said, well, they gave me such good care at the emergency room. And I said, well, that's good. And I said, Aunt Ellen, we pray and praise those people, but I want you to think about the people down at Coons. That's the little funeral home in her town. Wonder who's praying for Mr. Coons and his staff that are doing the burying. And my aunt, who is a very, very godly woman, said, that thought has never crossed my mind. I said, well, Aunt Ellen, she lives alone. Sometimes you just need to pray for Mr. Coons. He's buried all your family. He'll bury you. But what's it like for him these days? And I wish somehow we could have this outpouring for staff. I'm seeing Jennifer McBride, who set the Cadillac Gold standard at McConaughey and Hannity in Denver. I mean, it was the gold standard of care. And so many people are not recognized for this work. And there's still those people, now I can't name the organization, that just defames funeral directors. That's their big gig. Funeral directors are ripping people off and such things. And it just irritates the daylights out of me. But to say we need to find ways to celebrate individuals such as yourself who listen. We offer, in the Christian framework, a cup of cold water. I can't fix it, but I can be present to them. And I routinely told people at St. Luke's, I can't fix your problem. I'm going to listen to you, but I can offer you this word, Mekom Hanakama, which is the Jewish phrase for safe place of comfort. In my judgment, that's, especially these days, all we can do. I could offer that daughter standing in the cemetery in the rain on Good Friday some Mekom Hanakama, a safe place of comfort for that 30 minutes or so. And I think that's what you would do. And to say, how can we think about, I don't want to use the word makeup, but I think there's going to be a lot of having to catch up with people whose grief has not been supported. And in essence, is still percolating. It's like the kettle on the stove. You hear it, steaming. And I think there are going to be some real consequences. So we also have to think about, well, when we can, how will we offer the support? The really demanding days for clinicians in grief field is coming.
Harold, that's actually a great lead in to the next question
Okay.
that we have. Brian, if you would unmute yourself with your question, please.
Thank you, Fran and Andy
Yes.
and Dr. Ivan Smith. It's so good to see you. You have certainly offered that safe place and sanctuary
Thank
to
you.
many, as well as us as colleagues. Yes, following up, with all the changes in the funeral industry to accommodate for COVID-19, what lasting effects will this have not only on the funeral industry, but on those who are grieving?
Wow. I'm trying to get my head around it. I think 2 weeks ago, there was about 10 pages in the New York Times magazine on a family-owned funeral home in New York City. And it was stunning what those men are going through. Really PTSD, especially when those funeral home reps have to go into those refrigeration trucks and find a body. Yes, it is supposed to be very orderly and organized, but the reality is it isn't always so. And what some of those individuals have seen and experienced is going to be incredibly demanding. And funeral associations, I think, are going to have to provide a way to offer some group care, where it's small groups, where it's online, so that they can begin to process that, especially for bodies that have been in an apartment, haven't been immediately discovered, the deterioration, all that they're experiencing. I think I worry that some people are going to say, hey, we didn't go to the funeral when John died, so why do we need a funeral now? I think we're going to have to find a way, like Bill Warden, I think, says, you can pay me now or pay me later. If you do not do the ritual work, oh no, that's Bill Hoy. Bill Hoy said, if you don't do that ritual work, it's going to be like compounding interest. It's going to build up. I worked with one funeral home where they're saying, well, what can we do? And I said, well, what about going to a park and doing a community service with everybody spread out? And they'll have a chance to name names. But I already planted the seed. You've got to begin thinking about Christmas. You cannot let the holiday seasons go by without designing some way to reach up to these families. And we talked about, could you put candelabra in the covered porch of the funeral home? And people will come up and name their loved one remaining in the car, but that candle gets lit. Yes, it's not the greatest ritual because there won't be punch and cookies afterwards, but it is some ritual. And so I am hoping that it may take some persuading, Brian, to kind of stretch some directors' minds. For others, I think it's going to be, sure, let's do it. I worry too with this here in our valley where it's 10 minutes, and I got chastised for going over 10 minutes. And I went, it's a funeral, for God's sake. Well, it's a funeral in Southern California, and 10 minutes will do just fine. Well, I can't hardly say my name in 10 minutes, as this is proven on this teleconference. So I think we need to start thinking always, how can we do makeups to offer people some kind of collective ritual, or at least ideas, because who knows what Christmas is going to be like and December is going to be like in this country. I don't know. And I think that's part of our problem. If I knew what to do, I could plan for it. But not knowing, I don't quite know what to do.
In some ways, it becomes one of those things that history is going to we'll find out, right? We'll
Yes.
find out what the impact is. So Galen actually had a question similar to that, kind of looking back at history. Galen, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, I can do that. Good to see you, Harold Ivan.
Hey, Galen.
It's the question I have is looking at the 1918 pandemic that we had. What were some of the changes that came out of that really affected, like social changes and things? You kind of already touched on some of this anyway, I think, with the long-term stuff around funerals and rituals, that people will probably or might potentially step back from them and all. But are there any other kinds of things that you see now going forward other than that is really could be problematic for us?
Well, one thing I would tell you, at least it's not as bad as the Spanish flu, because they ran out of caskets. That was one major thing. I don't think that's happened yet. They ran out of space in cemeteries, and there was because you can imagine what cemetery workers were paid in 1918. So often the families told, you want a grave, you have to dig it. And if the family had sick members, we got to find somebody. In several Catholic dioceses, the bishops sent seminary students out to dig those graves. And finally, the Archbishop of Pittsburgh had a Catholic layman who owned a steam shovel. And the Archbishop commandeered it, and they dug long trenches. Now, you can see that in Brazil, some of the other countries, and you were just dropped in those trenches. And the problem was nobody knew where you were buried. So here are families that in that day it was so common, you go to the cemetery, and now they cannot tell you where your loved ones are buried. And I walked through a cemetery in Memphis where 800 people are buried, and there are no markers. You think of, boy, they got a lot of ground they can sell. And then I read through the little booklet, no, where you're standing, there are 800 people buried here during their epidemic. Of course, there was no pastoral care as such in those days. You might go to your priest or your rabbi or your minister, but there was no real equipping in those days for it to really work. So I think I think we're in a bit of a better place, and yet I have a feeling 50 or 100 years from now, they're going to look back and say, boy, they were really unprepared. They really didn't know what they were going to deal with. And Galen, I think the real issue is that, quite frankly, a lot of us deal with grievers either immediately, sometimes anticipatory grief if you're in hospice settings. And, you kind of, but I think in the future, we're going to be seeing people whose loved ones died early in COVID. And they have, especially, I say this kindly, I believe this, women who are the grief managers in many families. The weight that is on them, looking after the children, looking after, if say, mom dies and dad. In the New York Times this morning was a sobering article about all these children in New York City, both parents have died. And like, who's going to take care of them? And they're arguing, we want to stay in family. You're 16 years old. You cannot be the head of a family. So I think the long term is going to be, and here's the thing that troubles me. Many of the people I think who are going to need the counseling the most are going to be least likely to afford it. And I know how that sounds to individuals who have private practice or that sort of thing. I think philanthropies are going to have to come forward and create funds or something that counselors can be reimbursed. The number of people out of jobs who've lost their insurance. So they, the insurance policy said I would be entitled to 6 mental health sessions, but that's gone. And just transportation to a counselor. Now, one good thing, and I'm not sure about this, but it's what is that one person told me all the time they're saving in driving to their 2 counseling centers every day in, Chicago traffic. It's really great. They're saving all that time. And they're saying, I'm not so sure I ever want to do much in-person counseling if I have to drive and commute and do all of that. And yet, there was also an article in New York Times this morning talking about yesterday's New York Times of the increase in child abuse during this period. What are the consequences of that going to be? And it's like, I don't know exactly how to explain it. There's so many layers of the onion.
A Pandora's box.
Well, that's exactly one of the things, just hearing you talk, and even, I've thought about with the pandemic is certainly how taxing it becomes on funeral directors and what they're seeing and all the things you talked about. But this all also happened in the midst of many other situations we were dealing with on top of it. We already had a growing suicide rate in our country, and very specifically among certain populations in our country, right? On top of that, we have an opioid crisis that we were in the midst of, and those numbers were rising every year. So already our funeral directors, coroner's offices, I just, in talks I've given around the United States, every community that I speak in, someone raises their hand and says, did you know that our community is the worst in the United States? Every community was telling me this.
Yes.
With opioid crisis, with suicide rate, all of that, it's all going up. And in the midst of it, now we have a pandemic, right, where we're adding to the challenges, and the challenges that it was for funeral directors, even just dealing with the body of someone who overdosed, right? So this didn't just happen right in a vacuum. There was a greater situation.
On that point, with the opioid crisis, Heal Grief's #1 visited page is death of a child. It's mind-boggling that the cycle of life is so interrupted. But I do want to get to Janet Buntruck. If you could unmute yourself, you had a comment?
I was just referring to what I've been calling with my clients fragmented rituals. So I've been doing critical incident work in nursing homes where they've had multiple losses. So I did one where they'd had a staff member come into work and collapse. So the first responders were her colleagues, trained medical. And between the time I took the assignment on Friday and I went in on Monday, they'd had a second staff member die. High on my list of stupid things that said after a death is, at least it wasn't COVID. So, but that fragmented, how do we find little bits of time to acknowledge the sorrow? The one nursing home, we're socially distanced. I can't have more than 10 people in the room. We're 6 feet apart. We're masked. This was mostly an Ethiopian and Ghanaian community. And they brought in food. They brought in and you could take a plate. Somebody served you with the gloves, but things are so fragmented. I did at Fort Logan at the military cemetery, and you only get 6 minutes, Harold Ivan. You get 6 minutes as an officiant at Fort Logan, but they didn't have enough teams to do the 21 gun salute. So when we heard another one being done in the cemetery, we stopped. Or I stopped as the officiant and said, let's take that as John's 21 gun salute, because the family was deeply disturbed that here this ritual that they were owed was not being given them because they just can't get them through Fort Logan fast enough.
Yeah.
So the fragments, you take the little pieces you can get. I think the online tributes are even more important. But they're not coffee and cookies.
No.
They're not the hug. They're not looking across the table and sitting with. We did our reception outside. We're limited to 50 in public gatherings in Colorado, but we had 35 at one event and about 38 at the other. And we did our reception outside, but still, it's fragments.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, in the lectionary, was it 2 Sundays ago, it was about Jesus feeding the 5,000. And the disciples, very orderly, send them away so they can get something to eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And our priest really did a phenomenal job on that, saying, you feed them. And our Episcopal Church is now feeding 700 people each week. And we only expect that to increase. But he said the people of St. Mary's need to feed people. So it's that idea of, okay, what can I do? I think one thing some of you might start thinking about is easy to read brochures that are not going to be expensive, but, however you can do it, have it dressed up, of griever-friendly materials. Okay, so you didn't have the funeral you wanted. So you didn't have the memorial service you wanted. Because I think for some people, it's the difference between guilt and false guilt. My mother always said she wanted to be taken back to Illinois. And I had promised her that, and I could not do that. And now, there's still people that have these ideas of promises made bedside or deathside, or you got to take them to the bank. And to say, sometimes you did the best you could at the time. And one other thing I want to mention, if I could, in that regard, I think there's a secondary grief process for the loss of our assumptive worlds. And we're going to have to do a lot more on that, because I remember when I did my paper on the Spanish flu epidemic, and the last 3 pages said, we're going to get hit with another epidemic. A doctor reading it said, well, this is interesting, but this is not going to happen. With the American medical establishment, they'll nip it in the bud. Why are you putting this in? No, it's not going to happen. We got this. And so we're assuming so many assumptions, and I think that's happening among nursing staffs and hospitals. It's doing with lots of people. We've assumed things. And you know, I have a problem because we're getting some new neighbors, and somebody wrote me, "You live in Palm Springs. These people are living in Palm Springs. We want you to meet them, make them welcome." Yeah, well, I'm 72 years old, and that is technically a risk category, I guess. And how do I do what I'd like to do? But I don't know where they've been, and I know where I've been, right here in this house. But the feeling is I need to be reaching out. They're my new neighbors, but at the same time, what is it that I can do? And that thought never crossed my mind that some day you wouldn't be able to go down the street, ring the doorbell, and say, "Hey, I live around the corner. I'm friends of so and so." Grieving those assumptions. I think for many, it is the assumption I will not die alone. And I think that has been like a bruising trauma. It hasn't left scabs, but my loved one died alone. The best I could do was look on a phone and say her last few words. I think those assumptive world is something we're equipped to understand. And, you know, I explain it to people as like the two steering wheels on a driver's ed car or the co-wheels in an airplane. And that, yeah, you got to focus on this death, but you've also got to focus on the assumptive world. And that may be, where in the world is God? You know, and my aunt, she's believes in the Old Testament. So she said to me again this week, "Don't you think there's a plague sent from God?" And, you know, she's 95. I'm not going to convince her. And I said, "Aunt Ellen, why are children dying then? Why are wonderful people dying? Do you think God does those kind of things, and that it causes good people to die, children, the people that their lives are all ahead of them?" You know, one of the sad things in this community is we have a wonderful 32-year-old nurse, was right there in the COVID, you know, carrying their load. They developed COVID, and now they're at USC waiting for a double lung transplant. And you go, for God's sake, they're 32 years old. They got a whole career ahead of them. They were doing the right thing. Where is the fairness of that? And of course, it means somebody's going to have to die for them to get two lungs. So I think we're going to have a lot of work, and we're going to have to do some thinking ourselves. And part of it is this offering hospitality to grievers. I may not have answers to your question. I can't explain why God does what God does or does not do, but I can listen, and I think it's great that you're able to express some of those feelings about God. What does that mean, the absence of the predictable God in your life? Very, very important. Yeah.
You're muted, Fran.
I am?
No,
Fran,
I was. I'm sorry. Janet had a follow-up that she typed in. So difficult for the caregiver who is holding the phone as folks are saying goodbye to their loved ones.
Yes.
I mean, that in itself the weight of that time after time must be so challenging, even though it's not their direct family loss of a loved one. It's just the experience of that moment.
Yeah.
I had a caregiver say that she said, "I no longer felt like a caregiver. I felt like a perpetrator."
Oh.
She just felt like holding that phone, and they're looking through either a smartphone or a tablet, and they're seeing their person who's dying. And Andrew, have you had to do that in your role?
Hi, Harold Ivan.
Hi.
Here with hospice, we're seeing a lot of that. Fortunately, or unfortunately, as the case may be, who knows? It's not the same as being present. But we're able. We just purchased iPads so that loved ones can at least see their loved ones who are alone because there's so many places that are not allowing even our own nurses in for more than 2 weeks.
You know, and then there's a whole other twist to this. I mean, it's not only those that are left behind, but it's the person dying and what it must be like for them to be alone.
Yeah, and I think, in my religious understanding, we are not abandoned. I can't prove this, but I believe very much in the presence of angels. I kind of bring some of the old stuff I was taught as a child. I still see that place. I do not think the afterlife is so far removed from this life. I think sometimes they're like concentric circles that are moving, and there are those thin moments the Celtics talk about where you look into that. I have said to some people, some people have told me they, in one sense, were glad they weren't there to see them gasping for breath or fighting or with, losing their bowels, all those kind of things. And to say to them, now let's flip it. If the situation were reversed and you were the one dying, what would you say to your mother who feels this sense of, I wasn't there? What might you say to her to comfort her? There is a wonderful thing to borrow from Judaism, and I've taught this for years. Tzedakah, Tzedkah, some close spelling to that. But it's the idea of asking, what is something, let's say your mother did, that made the world a better place? Was there some act of kindness or justice or mercy that she did? And what was that? Well, now that she is dead, who is going to step forward and take on your mother's role in doing that? So would it be possible that you would agree to take on that role of your mother? And if somebody asks you, well, why do you do that? It's called tzedakah. It's out of Judaism. It's the tradition that all of us are here to make the world better. The people of the Jewish faith say it's to repair the torn fabric of humanity. And so I'm trying to, where it's kindness, where it's giving, where it's all kinds of things it can be. But to say, well, I did this because this is what my dad did. For example, my father did not believe in buying flowers when people died. He saw no purpose in that at all. And so, sometimes everybody's looking around the flowers and there's no flowers from the Smith family. But what I noticed, my dad would often slip bills into the hands of a widow or a mother and say, now you're going to need this in maybe a couple of weeks, and you use this for what you need. So very rarely do I send flowers. It's been strange a couple of times that I've sent and slipped $100 bill to a millionaire, but saying, this is a lesson my father taught me, was his tzedakah, and I am carrying it to my generation. And I know it's a $100 bill to you, that's not a lot, but it's a way of remembering my dad, that my dad's name and his tzedakah will not be forgotten. And I think that's the other thing we've got to do, get people to say the names. What was your mother's first name? Because I've said that a person is not gone until two things happen. We stop saying the name and we stop telling stories about them. Yeah. And I know there are families, don't bring up, no, that'll get everybody sad. No. And I've said in some cases, well, you don't think, how long have they been dead? 3 months? And so when you die, we'll know not to say your name after 3 months. Would that be enough time? And they, well, no, that's not what I meant. I go, well, you said we shouldn't be saying this person's name. It's going to make everybody say it. I believe to the core of my being, the greatest fear in this country is the fear of being forgotten. I don't think it's a fear of death or dying or fear of the afterlife as much as the fear of being forgotten. And as a single person, that goes through my mind many times. How will I be remembered? What probability I'm going to be forgotten, just one of the nameless people that lived on earth. And that's one reason I write a lot, hoping that something I have written will last long after I'm gone.
Well, it's that that fear, even just fear of annihilation, right? Like
Yes.
that it didn't matter that I was here, or whatever that might be. Well,
Yes.
Harold, we actually only have a few minutes left, but with our few minutes, I wanted to give you an opportunity. Quite often, folks who listen to the playback of this, or maybe even some who were just part of the discussion today, want to know how they can connect with you, with your work. What's the easiest way for folks to do that?
Okay, the very easiest way, I'm not tech savvy, so I don't have a website yet with bells and whistles and flashing neon lights. But the best way is just HaroldIvanSmith@gmail.com. That's always the fastest way. Harold Ivan Smith, one word, @gmail.com. That's the best way. And these days, bookstores being whatever they are, the easiest way to get my books is at Amazon.com. And the nice thing is you give them the credit card and they drop it in the mail the next day. Now, I can't guarantee when you're going to get it, but at least that's the best kind of way. And I'm really, to be honest, searching for an idea for another grief book. I'm really searching. I haven't quite thought about some ideas. So if you think of something you think I ought to write a book about or write an article about, I'd be open to that.
Well, you ask for it, you're going to get it, because there's some good ideas out there, and I know some folks in this group.
Okay.
We have some good ones too, but no, that's good. That's awesome.
Stories of COVID.
Well, yeah.
Harold, we want to thank you so much for being a guest here for this discussion forum and for sharing your work with our audience.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity and for all you do behind the scenes to make this technology work, and for the care you give to grievers in your immediate neighborhoods. You're doing fabulous work. And I just think, I would never have dreamed this 10 years ago, that you could do something and talk to people scattered everywhere. That wouldn't have crossed my mind. I'd had to get on a plane and fly somewhere and speak to 100 people and fly home and stay a couple nights in a hotel. And now here I am sitting at the bar in the kitchen area, or the food station, or whatever it's called, this thing in the middle of the room. And I'm talking to you, and this is, by the way, confession, this is not my library behind me. Mine is not nearly this organized. It's just a picture, but it's terribly impressive.
Maybe we're going to start to see a lot more virtual memorials, so families and friends from around the globe can participate and celebrate the life of their person.
Yes.
So again, thank you, Harold.
Thank you.
And thank you to all those who've joined us for the discussion forum here live. And we also are grateful for those who will be watching this on playback. We're glad that you are connecting with this, and we hope that it's helpful to you. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults, a program called Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to join our AMF app so you too can be part of a community of others with similar goals and interests.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the AMF Members Discussion Forum.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Andy. Thank you, Harold.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you all.